Welcome back to our continuing series on the book of Nehemiah. Glad you're with us. As you may remember, we're kind of treating the book of Nehemiah as a biblical biography, if you will, of a leader. And it's great to approach the book that way so we can see what the text wants to talk about and we can draw some practical applications as well. As always, there's the number on the screen. It's also online. You can download the handout with some discussion questions, but also has the number for texting questions during class. So if you have questions, love to try to address those if we can, so please text those in. Well, let me say a prayer for us, and we're going to dive right in. This is a really interesting lesson tonight. Lord, thank you for your mercy. Thank you for your grace. We're grateful for the country in which we live because of the freedoms that we have to gather, to study your word, and then to go speak. And I pray, Father, that you would continue to give us the boldness to speak and the compassion to reach people where they are. I do pray for all those in the sound of my voice that you would be with those who are grieving, those who need healing, those who need comfort, that your spirit would be ever close to us. In Christ's name, amen. Well, we're looking at some leadership lessons from this ancient book of Nehemiah. If you just remember the basic history of this is at the end of the Old Testament period. So Nehemiah is going to, I think I still have the timeline on your handout, so you can just kind of see the basic events and how some of the books of the Bible fit into these historical events. But historically, Nehemiah left the service of the Persian king, went back to Jerusalem specifically to rebuild the wall and thereby effectively rebuilding the fortunes of the Jewish people in about 444 BC. And the Old Testament stops speaking, if you will, about 400 BC. So this is right at the tail end of the Old Testament story of what God's doing. And of course, a lot of the Old Testament's looking forward to the Messiah coming, to the end times. And there's a silent period, if you will, between 400 BC and the time of Jesus. And so there's this time of expectant waiting for those prophecies to come true. Well, part of that is Nehemiah rebuilding the wall so that God can reestablish the Jewish people so that Jesus, the Messiah, can be born from the Jewish people. So all of this ties into God's big plan. Nehemiah doesn't know that everything he's doing is tying in, but it is part of God's plan. So we're learning some lessons as we just step through. We're literally going through the text in order, chapter by chapter, and just following the chronology of this. But we looked at the first step, and what Nehemiah did first was he prayed, and he committed this endeavor to God. He didn't say, I want to do this, God, would you please come help me? He appealed to God and said, God, I know you want to restore the fortunes of your people. We confess our sins. We're turning back to you. Restore our fortunes. So he prayed, he committed that endeavor to God. Then he prepared. He's going to go before the king, but before he does his homework and he prepares and he gets the names of the people he's going to need and he figures out about how much timber they're going to need and so forth. He expects God to move. Now, God may have said no to his prayer. He goes to the king and the king says, no, you can't leave, stay here. It's not going to happen. Fine, that's an answered prayer. It's not necessarily the answer he wants, but it's an answered prayer. But he expects God to move, and so he's prepared. And God gives him favor with the king, and the king says, yes, and I will help you. What do you need? And he said, here's the plan. Then we talked about commitment. So he leaves his job, he leaves the comfort of the capital of the Persian Empire, and he sets out and he goes to Jerusalem where the walls are torn down, the people are barely subsisting, and he decides, what am I willing to give for this project to succeed? And you find out that he's willing to give his life because there are people trying to kill them to keep this from happening. He's certainly willing to give up his comfort. He's willing to give up his BMW and his two-car garage to go, to have a scooter, around Jerusalem, right? I mean, bottom line, he's willing, he knows what he's willing to give for this to happen. And then finally, he, as a leader, he knows to expect opposition. And so in our last lesson, we saw this map, I think is useful to see the opposition from everyone around him. And we looked a lot at the historicity of this in our last lesson, because all of these characters that are mentioned in the book of Nehemiah in the Bible are also mentioned and substantiated archaeologically outside the Bible. And so Sanballat, who opposed the rebuilding, is the governor of Samaria, has an army. Tobiah is part of a dynasty that lasted quite a while of the kings of the Ammonites. You have Geshem, who is an Arab, and he is the king of a huge Arab empire in the south. Then you have the remnants of the Philistines. They've now come to be called the Ashdodites. And so literally surrounding Jerusalem are all of these foes that are opposed to what they're trying to do. So you see in our last lesson the idea of you should expect opposition and how he went about approaching that opposition. Well, as we move on, he continues, and they get the wall built to about half the height all the way around, despite them wanting to kill them, bringing soldiers, threatening to attack them. But Nehemiah leads this to where they continue the work even in the face of death, in the face of attack. But the next chapter brings opposition of a different kind. And so they appear to have overcome the threat of war, and the road is clear for them to continue building the wall. But as we move into chapter 5, here's what happens. Now there arose a great outcry of the people and of their wives against their Jewish brothers. This is not Sanballat or the Arabs. These are the Jewish people involved in the work. And there begins to be some internal dissension. And an outcry came from some of the Jews against others of the Jews. For there were those who said, with our sons and daughters we are many, so let us get grain that we may eat and keep alive. So here's the issue, is when they're all working on the walls, they're not able to farm and build their grain. And so they're running a deficit spending, if you will. So what's happening is they are not able to sustain themselves and do the wall. And so they're going into debt to buy food, and that's what they're saying here. There were also those who said, we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses to get grain because of the famine. So not only are they building the wall, they're building the wall in a time when it's not good crops in any case. And he said, look, we're having to mortgage our fields for this. Things are going against us. Now our flesh is as the flesh of our brothers, our children are as their children, meaning there's some of the Jews that are not involved in this work. And when we went back and looked at the list, we saw that some of the noblemen, some of the leading people were involved and others were not involved. And what he's saying is, look, we have fellow Jews and our kids are just as good as their kids and we're just as Jewish as they are, but we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves, and some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but it is not in our power to help it, for other men have our fields and our vineyards. So what's happening? Some of the Jews are basically seeing this as an opportunity to buy up the land really cheap. It's like, look, you need grain. So grateful that you're working on the wall. What a wonderful civic project. I'll tell you what, I'll give you the grain, but I need a mortgage on your farm. And, oh, you need more grain? Well, now your farm is mine. Oh, you need more grain? Well, what do you have to sell? Well, in those days, you could indenture your children into service. So when they talk about slaves, they're talking about a little different kind of slavery than we typically think about in America or American history. What they're thinking of is indentured servitude. So you would say to your son or your daughter, you are now going to go work for this person and you're going to work for them for 7 years, and that's going to pay off our debt. And so they're enslaving their children. They're selling their children, and it's not quite as bad as it sounds, but they're basically indenturing their children as servants to other Jews. And Nehemiah said, I was very angry when I heard their outcry and these words. So what's happening here, and what's going to be the theme of this next chapter of Nehemiah's challenges, is that really the internal challenges are oftentimes greater than the external challenges. And that's just as true in the church today as it was the Jewish people then. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But probably the greatest threats, in my view, to Christian church today comes from the divisiveness inside the Christian church, I believe is greater than the threat from outside the Christian church. Well, it certainly was the case here, because at this point, they're building a wall, and the question is there anybody left to build a wall for? And you have certain Jews who are setting themselves up to be in really good shape, while other people are making the sacrifices for it to happen. You know what we call that? We call that oppression. They're oppressing people by taking advantage of these people. So what does Nehemiah do? I took counsel with myself. This is why I like Nehemiah. There are two kinds of people. People that like to process things by themselves, and people that like to process things with other people. I like Nehemiah because he liked to process things by himself. My wife does not like Nehemiah because he just won't talk. You don't know what the guy's thinking, right? But in all seriousness, he said, I took counsel with myself and I thought about this, and I brought charges against the nobles and the officials. And I said to them, you are exacting interest from your fellow Jews. And I held a great assembly against them. I get all the people together and said, we, as far as we are able, have bought back our Jewish brothers, have been sold to the nations. So I want you to see just how bad this really is. Not only are they taking advantage of their fellow Jews, but Nehemiah says a lot of the Jews here have been on such hard times that they've sold their children out to Sanballat or to the Ashdodites or whatever to live, to survive. And so we have Jewish people that are indentured slaves to some of, when he says the nations, he means non-Jews. You typically translate that in the New Testament, Gentiles. In other words, the non-Jewish people. And what does Nehemiah said? He said, when we can, we buy them out of that contract so that the Jews can be free and be here. He says, and you know what you guys are doing? You're not only getting them, you're selling them off to the nations, and we're having to go try and buy them back. Oh, he is ticked. I mean, he is really upset about this, and it makes no sense, does it? He says, we have bought back our Jewish brothers as far as we've been able, but you even sell your brothers that they may be sold back to us. They were silent and could not find a word to say. So I said, the thing that you are doing is not good. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations, our enemies? This idea of the fear of God, I want to take just a small sideline because that's not a phrase that's very favorable to us. We have a hard time wrestling with what does it mean to be afraid of God? Well, first thing I'd say is the scripture, the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Old Testament thinks fear of God is a very good thing. Think about the Psalms, think about Proverbs. The fear of God is the beginning of knowledge. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. It's like, well, this is a good thing. This is something that you need if you want to be wise. Here, what he's saying is he's appealing to a higher standard, to a shared value, and he's saying, listen, even if you're not afraid to do this, surely the fear of God would be a restraint on your behavior. And in fact, that's been true in Judeo-Christian societies ever since then. The idea of, and think about the founders of this nation, they understood, and leaving aside whether it's Christian nation or was founded as a Christian nation, no question that our system of government, for example, is built on Judeo-Christian principles. One of those principles is that the essence of justice is not might makes right, or you might go to jail. The essence of justice is the fear of a higher power, and that the fear of God exercises a restraining influence on human behavior. That's why our founding fathers said that our Constitution, you've probably heard these quotes before, but our Constitution was made for a moral people. What does that mean? It's made for a people who have some external restraints and internal restraints on their behavior besides the government. Our system of government is not effective at controlling people's behavior. Xi Jinping has a system that's extremely effective at controlling people's behavior, but our system of government is not. It presupposes that there are external restraints on our behavior. That Judeo-Christian value, if you will, that's basically what he's appealing to here. And so one of the interesting things that he does as a leader is he appeals to a standard that they share. And so one of the leadership lessons out of this is, as you as a leader, when you're trying to resolve problems internally, is to appeal to a common value. And this is true whether you're in a Christian environment or a non-Christian environment. Because you might say, well, the place that I work is not a Christian business. I can't say, don't you guys fear God? Because maybe half the people would say, no, I don't. And so how then do you appeal to a common value? Well, as Christians, here's what we believe. We believe that there are actually common values. And I know that may be hard to find, but actually, I would say it this way. As a leader, appeal to the best in people. Appeal to the best in people. They will let you down on a regular basis. But if you're going to fail forward. In other words, fail by calling people to unite around what is best in people. Because no matter what people believe, and I'm not saying they're all going to behave with loyalty and integrity and compassion and justice, but there is wired inside people a predisposition to know that there is such a thing as justice, that loyalty is a good thing. There are not many people, and there certainly aren't civilizations in history that you're going to find. There are civilizations that are not even slightly Christian, and their morals are very different. But you'd be hard-pressed to find any civilization that doesn't value loyalty to the people that are in your clan or your tribe or whatever. People that are going to look and value compassionate people and see them as heroes. Are the people that are going to look at integrity and say, yes, it's good to have integrity because at least you can do business with those people. That's kind of wired into a lot of people. And I'm not telling you this always works. What I'm telling you is that as he appeals to the fear of God to his fellow Jews, we as leaders oftentimes should find some kind of common value to appeal to. And that's one of the important ways to deal with internal dissent. This goes to every kind of dissent that you have. It really is helpful even in, let's take for example, let's just say the unusual event of you having an argument with your spouse. I know that doesn't happen to anybody in here, but let's say you're having an argument with your spouse. That's another kind of internal dissent, isn't it? Well, probably one of the great ways to deal with that is simply to step back and appeal to something you have in common. And that is, we are on the same side. We do disagree, but we are on the same side and we do love each other. And it never hurts to kind of pull that out in the middle of the argument and reset this and say, maybe we should both look here. Well, that's what leaders do, is when you have that internal dissent, let's see if we can find a common value or a rallying point. And that's what Nehemiah does here. Next, he said, moreover, I and my brothers and my servants, he's still talking to these people, are lending money and grain. In other words, he said, I'm not taking a mortgage on there, but everything, he's a pretty rich guy. He had a really good job. And so he comes and he said, I'm spending my personal fortune to feed these people, and I'm not taking a mortgage on their land. We are engaged. I'm committed. Remember, he said, what are you committed? He's committed his whole fortune. He's committed his life, whatever it takes to do it. He doesn't want their land. He wants them to keep building. He said, so I and my brothers and my servants are lending them money and grain. Let us abandon this exacting of interest. Return to them this very day their fields, their vineyards, their olive orchards, their houses, and the percentage of money, grain, wine, and oil that you have been exacting from them. In other words, tear up the mortgages, forgive the debts, do the right thing. Then they said, we will restore these and require nothing from them. We will do as you say. Well, it worked, didn't it? He said, look, we have a shared value in that we serve God, we fear God, we want to honor God, and this that you're doing is not honoring God. And it worked. It brought them together, and they said, you're right, we shouldn't be doing this, we're going to make this right. But now I want you to see the next thing he does, and this is the second part of what a good leader does, is like, okay, you guys agreed, let's be really clear about what we've agreed on. Clarity is your friend as a leader. They basically have agreed, so they've made this covenant, this agreement that says, yes, we're going to tear those things up. So what does Nehemiah do? He says, I called the priests, and I made them all swear to do as they had promised. I shook out the fold of my garment. They're just melodramatic. I shook out my garment and said, may God shake out every man from his house and from his labor who does not keep this promise. So may he be shaken out and emptied. So he commends them, and they swear to do as they had said, and then he threatens them with a curse. I feel like that's good leadership, people. I mean, you got the carrot, you got the stick. You know, it's like, you get clarity and say, yes, you're going to do it. You've committed to do it. Oh, and by the way, the curse of God will be upon you if you do not. I think you should use that more often. And all the assembly said amen and praised the Lord, and the people did as they had promised. So one of the things I like about Nehemiah is he obviously has a heart for God, a heart for prayer. He calls them to do the right thing for the right reasons. And then he has clarity about his expectations and about his goals. And if you remember back when he was dividing up the wall, there was great clarity on who's building which piece of the wall. And now he doesn't leave it kind of fuzzy. He just nails it down and said, bring the priests. They're going to swear an oath today of what they're going to do. This is my expectation. These are our goals. And so you get clarity, and it kind of establishes what everybody is expecting. Moreover, he says, now he's back to speaking to us instead of speaking to them. He said, moreover, from the time that I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, and he tells you when that was, the 20th year to the 32nd year of Artaxerxes the king, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allowance of the government. The former governors who were before me laid heavy burdens on the people. They taxed them and took from them their daily ration of 40 shekels of silver. In other words, this is your taxes to support the government. Even their servants lorded it over the people, but I did not do so because of the fear of God. In other words, Nehemiah has a keen sense that I'm on a mission from God. This is God's business. Remember, he's committed this endeavor to God. He's committed this family, this business, this endeavor to God. And he realizes, I'm now a steward. I work for God. I'm implementing this for God. I'm going to have to give an accounting to God. Well, that sounds very Christian, doesn't it? We will give an accounting to God of how we have stewarded it. Think about the parable of the talents, parable of the shrewd manager. Jesus says, the day will come when God will say, what have you done with what I have given you? And he says, to whom much is given, much is expected. Now, he's not talking about good deeds so you can earn your way into heaven. That's by grace. What he's talking about is, do you love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? Well, if so, then you'll be about his business, and you'll be diligently doing his business to the best of your abilities. And so he knows he's going to give an accounting to God. And so he said, I did not lord it over the people. I didn't charge them any taxes. I used my own personal money because I want a clean conscience before God. He said, I also persevered in the work on this wall. In other words, he too worked on the wall. And we acquired no land, and all my servants were gathered there for the work. In other words, great and small, everybody pitched in. Moreover, there were at my table 150 men, Jews and officials, besides those who came to us. In other words, he had to feed the government, if you will, the administration. He said, now what was prepared at my expense each day was 1 ox, 6 sheep, and birds, and every 10 days all kinds of wine in abundance. Yet for all this I did not demand the food allowance of the governor, because the service was too heavy on this people. In politics, when you see this kind of an idea from your rulers, this is called servant leadership. And it's not servant leadership like I'm out there serving the people. What it says is I'm putting the interests of the people before my own. That's servant leadership. Where politics tends to get, and that's good politics, that's good rule. That's putting the good of the nation or the good of the city or the good of the people you're there to serve. You're a public servant ahead of your own personal gain. And unlike some of the other Jews, he does. Politics gets a bad name when you think people using power and putting their self-interest above the interests of the people that they're serving. So politics is a reality of our life. Good politics, bad politics, the difference is this. Whose interest do you put first? And so Nehemiah has a great record here, and he wants people to know, look, I'm transparent with you. I want to put your interests ahead of mine. And so he says, remember for my good, oh my God, all that I have done for this people. What is he thinking? He says, my reward will come from God. I don't require it to be exacted from these people. A good leader, because he leads by example. And this is the second idea, is leading by example. One is appealing, in internal strife, appeal to a higher value that can rally people together, that can get us above our disagreements. The second is that you as a leader lead by example. Doesn't mean you have to do all the work, but it does mean that you need to demonstrate the idea that I am committed to this project, whether it's a project at work or it's a family or whatever. You need to demonstrate your commitment, because your team's commitment will likely never exceed the commitment of the leader. Have you ever worked on a project with a leader and you can't even find them half the time, right? I mean, it's like they're just not working very hard. I know that's never happened to you, but I once had a boss like that. Well, I had a lot of bosses like that. But anyway, the point is, if you have a boss like that, what does that do to your motivation? Well, it tanks your motivation. Well, if the boss isn't interested, why am I, staying late at work? And why am I doing these things? Well, that's human of us to think that. It may not be flattering, but it's human. And so the idea is that as a leader, leading by example means demonstrating that you are committed, and don't expect your team to have any greater commitment than you do. Now, you won't do the same work. I mean, you have your role, they have their role, but the commitment needs to be there. And I like that, because that's what Nehemiah has done. He said, I'm committed to this work because I'm willing to give my money, willing to give my time, willing to call to account some of the people that are oppressing you. I want to right the wrongs. I'm willing to stand up to Sanballat and the enemies who are threatening us. In other words, his commitment is unquestioned. And I think that's one of the great examples of Nehemiah for us in terms of leadership. The New Testament is abundant in examples of this as well. Now, fast forward to you and me in the New Covenant, in Christian times, we have so many examples of commitment. Obviously, we have the great example of Jesus Christ, who for the joy that was set before him was willing to endure the cross so that we could live. Now, that's total commitment. But think about the people that followed, people like you and me. This is a map of Paul's missionary journeys. So Paul was persecutor of the church, and along about 35 AD, a couple years after the resurrection, he's persecuting Christians. Jesus comes and says, hey, Saul, he says, who are you? He said, I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. And Paul says, oh no, Big mistake. And Jesus said, yes, definitely a big mistake. And he said, and so Paul said, what are you going to do to me? I've been killing Christians. And he goes, yes, but I actually have a job for you. And so I'm willing to let that go if you will come do what I want you to do. And so, all joking aside, he gives Paul this commission. And so Paul, it's not like he's part of the Baptist mission board. It's not like he's got a sending organization. Paul just said, oh, he wants me to go preach to the Gentiles. So he starts teaching in Antioch in Syria, and then he begins to make these trips. And he's not well funded on these trips. He just says, this is my mission, off I go. And so he, over the years, between about 46 AD and when he dies in 68, so about 22 years, he visits all of these places that you see in various long trips. And for him, these trips were not easy. They weren't like you had hotels that you could stay at. You know, this was difficult, but he was faithful to do that. Paul never had any money. Paul didn't have a house. Paul was completely committed to the mission. That doesn't mean the same is true for you, that you should sell your house and go off on a missionary journey. The point is that we have examples of commitment where they've led by example. It would be different if, think about all the disciples that you know. Of the 12, only one of them died a natural death. And he was put in prison and tortured and all things happened to him, but only one of them died in bed. The rest of them were killed for doing that. None of them ever did well in their 401k. None of them had a retirement plan. In fact, they all were an example of being all in. It's not like they were basically, they did good and they were really successful at doing it. And I think that's for a reason. I think that's God saying to us, I want to give you an example of people who are all in. Nehemiah was an example to the Jews, and I think the early believers, not just the apostles that we know. If you read the early church fathers, just average Christians who are willing to have their houses confiscated, their lives forfeit, thrown into the arena with the wild animals. There are a lot of examples of people who led us by their example. And the Apostle Paul is one. And we just know a little bit. This is from 2 Corinthians, and he doesn't talk about this much. But in the midst of another argument, he says this: are these people that are teaching you things that are wrong, are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they the offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm a better servant of Christ. He says, I'm talking like a madman here, but I've done more than they have done. You need to listen to me. I've been in prison more times than they have. I've had countless beatings. I've often been near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. That's the Romans. Once I was stoned, and they thought he was dead or they would have continued to stone him. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from robbers, in danger from my own people, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, and danger from false brothers. In toil and hardship through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from all that, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak and I am not weak? Who is made to fall and I am not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. Well, if you just look at that, you think to yourself, first of all, there's no prosperity gospel in this. Somebody asked a question about that a few weeks ago. There's nothing that even hints a prosperity gospel. There's nothing in here but absolute, total, committed faith and trust in God. He is an example for us like Nehemiah was an example for the Jews. And so this leading by example, our God even leads us by example. And the application I want to make of this is it's easy for you and I now to look back and say, you're right. If I need to know what it looks like to be completely committed to God, I don't have to say I'm the first person to do this. Bible's full of people that have done it, and you see them commended by God for their faith. In other words, it's easier for me. I'm not the first person to do this. As the book of Hebrews says, we're surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, meaning we've got people that have witnessed this for us and done it for us. But I bet you don't think about, and I'm sure you do think about that, and I think it emboldens us. But what you don't think about is you are someone's example. You are leading in terms of faith. I'm not talking about your job now. You are leading, whether it's your kids or your grandkids or your next door neighbor who's watching you. You don't know who's watching you, but your commitment to your faith, you are leading people and you don't always even know that you're leading. And that's why it's so important that we live out our faith, because we are leading by example. I know that you realize we have examples. I just don't know if you think about yourself that you are an example. And you may say, no, nobody's watching me. I guarantee you there are people watching you. I guarantee you that there are people who are being encouraged when they see you living out your faith. And we're missing an opportunity when we don't live out our faith. So we're leaders too, and we need to lead by example. Well, chapter 6 opens, and he's dealt with the problems with the Jews that were extracting the interest, and he's appealed to a higher standard. He's setting an example. But now he faces a conspiracy. You remember when we talked about Sanballat and Tobiah, that some of the Jewish leadership families were related to them by marriage. Now that's not kosher, but they were. And so they've got business interests together. And so some of the Jewish leaders are kind of torn here, and they end up becoming part of a conspiracy to get Nehemiah, either kill him or get him to stop, so that they can keep the status quo. Now, when Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem the Arab and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall and that there was no breach left in it, although it was only halfway up at that time, Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, come, we should have a conference together. But they intended to kill me. And I sent a messenger to them saying, would love to visit with you boys, but I've got this big thing going and I can't come down. I can't stop work long enough to meet you. And they sent to me 4 times this way, and I answered them in the same manner. So they're like, so he didn't fall for that. So they've got something else up their sleeve. He said, in the same way, Sanballat for the 5th time sent his servant to me with an open letter in his hand. That's actually significant. So the way letters worked in those days is you would write your letter, you would roll it up, you'd put a little wax on it, and you'd seal it. And it said, hey, this is from Sanballat. And when you got the letter, that seal was sealed. It was not broken, you know. Okay, nobody read your mail. This is private, so you open it. So he brings him an open letter. What's that saying? That's the modern day equivalent of posting it on social media. That means everybody knows what's in this letter, right? And that's a ploy, because look what's in the letter. He said, sent to me with an open letter in his hand, and in it was written, everybody says, and Geshem also says it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel against Artaxerxes, and that's why you're building the wall. And everybody thinks that you are going to become their king, and you set up prophets to proclaim concerning you in Jerusalem, there's a new king in Judah. And now the king, Artaxerxes, is going to hear about this. I guarantee you he is, because you put it on social media. So now come and let us take counsel together. It's like, I'm on your side, but man, everybody's saying this about you. You know, mainly me, but everybody's saying this about you. You probably better come visit with me so we can kill you. And so you get this kind of conspiracy going here. So then I sent to him saying, no such thing as you are saying has been done. You are inventing this out of your own mind. For they wanted to scare us, thinking their hands will drop from the work and it will not be done. What's he saying? They're trying to demoralize us, divide us, by letting all the Jews know that, hey, Geshem says Nehemiah's going to make himself king. We've been suckers. We're building this wall, and he's going to take advantage of us. Nice rumor to start, right? Against him. And the word is out about this. So they're trying to sow that kind of dissension. But look what he says. And remember I told you in this that there are going to be little phrases here and there that you're going to pluck out of Nehemiah, and you're going to remember these phrases long after the book. You've forgotten about this book. One of them was, remember when they had the opposition, he said, so we said a prayer and we posted a guard. That's a beautiful little phrase, isn't it? That says praying and expecting God to act and working are not mutually exclusive. I love this little phrase. This is a prayer that I suspect you, like I, have prayed many times and will pray many times. And so in the face of this, he said, but now, O God, strengthen my hands. Strengthen my hands for the work, because everybody's spreading lies about me. And now they're trying to not just kill us, they're trying to undermine my reputation. They're trying to cancel me on social media. Twitter has banned me. Facebook has suspended me. And what's his answer? Dear God, strengthen my hands for the task ahead. That is a great prayer when you don't know what to pray. Is God strengthen my hands? So he perseveres, even so. But listen to this. This is where it gets probably the lowest point. Now I went into the house of Shemaiah, son of. Shemaiah is a Jew. And he said, you and I need to go meet in the house of God. We need to go to the temple. In fact, we need to close the doors of the temple because they are coming to kill you. They are coming to kill you by night. So this is a fellow Jew who pretends to be his friend and says, I think they're going to kill you. Let's go. I'll go with you. We're going to go lock ourselves in the temple. But I said, should I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in. What does that mean? What's happening here? What they're saying is, if he goes into the temple and bolts the door, what does that say to all of his followers? Well, I value my life more than yours. You can stay out there and risk your life, but I'm not going to risk my life. And in fact, I'm afraid. And I've given up, and I'm not willing to resist anymore. So this was a wolf in sheep's clothing. This is a fellow Jew who comes to him and says, look, I have information, they're going to kill you. I just want to save your life. And he's like, wait a minute. This is going to completely demoralize people. It's going to undermine what we're trying to do. And I understood and saw that God had not sent him. What's this telling you? He came and he basically draped what he's saying in God. Have you ever been anybody who dressed everything up with religion and said, we need to do this, and by the way, pretty sure God wants you to do this. Pretty sure God wants to do this, so you probably better do this or God's going to be mad at you. Well, that's kind of what's happened here. They're kind of dressing it up. What are their real motives? Their real motives are to stop him because they're in league. He's in league with the enemies. He said, but I saw that God had not sent him, but he pronounced the prophecy. This is literally a false prophet. God said, we need to save your life and you need to go do this with me. He pronounced the prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him to do so. Worst kind of betrayal. For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way and sin, so they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat, oh my God. Now you might want to use this prayer every now and then too. According to these things that they did, and also to the prophetess Noadiah, this is another Jew, and the rest of the prophets who wanted to make me afraid. Well, that's interesting. You learn two things from this. Number one, there were female prophets in those days. And number two, at least this lady wasn't a good one. But there are a bunch of prophets, apparently, who've been enlisted and hired and said, let's use the God card. Let's go tell him that God wants this to be done. And so as you think about it, first it was taunting, then it was threatening to kill them, then it was the intimidation of Artaxerxes is going to get mad at you. Then it was the trying to trap him and kill him. Then it was enlisting some of his own people against him. If you think about it, this leader faced opposition that's probably greater than much of what we face. What's really interesting is to look at how did he deal with it? How did he do it? And the answer is he always turned to God. And he always said, God, repay them for what they're doing. I'm going to stand my ground. God, strengthen my hands for the task. We said a prayer to God and we posted a guard to protect ourselves. I think there's a great lesson there as leaders for us as well when you encounter that kind of problem from within. So I'd like to talk for just a minute about this idea of false prophets and false prophecy, because that's also something that happens today, is you get this idea of false teachers, false prophets who take ideas that are undermining ideas and wrap them in the gospel, wrap them in God, and say, God really does want you to do this, or God really doesn't want you to do that. And this idea, the New Testament talks a lot about false prophets. I'll give you a couple of passages. In Galatians 1, Paul says this, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you. So they're listening to some false teachers who are saying, Paul didn't know what he's talking about. That's not right. You need to come do this stuff instead. He said, I can't believe you guys are so gullible. He said, even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you another gospel, even though there isn't such a thing, let him be accursed. As we have said before, and I'm going to say again, if anyone is preaching to you something different, let him be accursed. This is stronger than you think it is. This is like saying that person is going to hell. I mean, this is strong statement. He's dead serious. It's like saying anybody comes here and teaches you something different than what the Bible says, than what Jesus said, then that person ought to go straight to hell. I mean, he's so serious about this. So sometimes false teaching is really a big deal. And look what he says. Am I seeking the approval of man or of God? What's he saying is, here's a great way to measure this. Nehemiah said, am I seeking to profit from you or am I seeking favor with God? Well, obviously he's not seeking to profit from them. Paul's saying, I'm going to talk to you bluntly because do you think I care what anybody here thinks about me? Do you think I'm a people pleaser? No, I've got to answer to God and I'm going to tell you straight that this is the truth. Same thing for us is this idea of sometimes we have difficulty with false teaching, with things that are wrapped in good motives but aren't the right thing to do because we're people pleasing. It's just part of who we are, and we just don't want to create a stir. Second thing, I want to analyze that a little bit more and answer a question about it. But second one is this. This is Peter. He said, false prophets arose among the people. He's talking about Nehemiah and others in that time, just as there will be false teachers among you who will secretly bring in destructive heresies. Heresies means divisions, new teachings that take sects away, that divide people, even denying the master who bought them, bringing upon themselves swift destruction. And many will follow their sensuality, comfort. Two reasons that I think, and two ways to watch for false teaching. One is, are those teachers currying favor with someone other than God? And second, are they profiting mightily from it and seeking comfort and sensuality? In their greed, they will exploit you with false words. Their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not sleeping. In other words, God will deal with that, but we must be discerning enough to know. Nehemiah is a good example of a leader because he was discerning enough to know what God really wanted. He saw through the false prophecy, and consequently, he was able to lead the people. Because if Nehemiah had fallen for this, all of the people were going to be scattered as well. The whole effort was going to fall apart. And you as leaders bear a burden of what I call discernment. the ability to discern, the ability to distinguish between what's true, what's not true, what's right and what's not right, even when it's dressed up in the noblest of motives. A discerning spirit is an important thing for a leader because so many people are relying on you to get it right. But here's the interesting question, because I want us to be a little bit careful. There's a difference between being a false teacher and just being wrong. There's a difference between being evil and being wrong. Sincerity is not the difference. You can be sincerely wrong and you can be sincerely evil. What is the difference between being wrong, like you're a teacher teaching something and it's just not right, but it's not necessarily evil? And as you look at the New Testament, and this is leaders, is where I think we need discernment. Sometimes we're overly discerning, I suppose, and sometimes they're just people that are wrong. They're going to teach something about the end times, they're going to teach some issue about the New Testament, and they may very well be wrong and you may be right. But there's no call to treat them like, well, you're evil. No call for this. They're not this kind of person. On the other hand, sometimes there are people who are teaching things that really, really matter, and sometimes we're just too mild about that. How do you know the difference when you discern between the difference between a false teacher and what's wrong? Is that interesting? If not, we'll just skip it and move on. Yeah, it is. It's a matter. It's important. If you look at the New Testament, here's the bright line. As I've looked at the New Testament, Jesus got very vehemently upset at certain teachers and not so much with others. The same is true of Paul, Peter, John, Jude. In fact, all the writers of the New Testament talk about this idea of false teaching. And when I ask myself this question, what do they think is evil? And what are they kind of tolerant about? For example, Paul's going to teach in 1 Corinthians and Romans, because it's happening in much places. He's going to say, look, you Gentile Christians know that you can eat meat that came from anywhere. But your fellow Christians who used to be Jews, they're not going to eat meat that's been sacrificed to Zeus. They were raised and brought up that's unclean. We do not, because it's tainted by an idol. He said, now I'm just going to tell you, here's the truth on this matter. You can eat any meat that you want to eat. You give thanks to God. Idols are nothing. They don't even exist. Zeus isn't real. But even though your Jewish brothers or sisters are not correct about this, I want you not to eat that meat. And I want you to accommodate them. And it's like if they have a matter of conscience and go, whoa, are you going to eat that? That's sacrificed to Zeus. And you'd say, no, then I think I won't eat that. Remember he said, I'd rather never eat meat again at all. He's exaggerating. I'd rather never eat meat again at all than to cause a division with my brother. They were wrong, weren't they? But they weren't evil. And so what's Paul's attitude on that? They're wrong. Let's love them. We're going to get along. And in fact, I'm not going to insist on my rights. If it's a big deal, okay, I don't necessarily need that pulled pork sandwich. I'm fine with that, right? So what then do they get upset about? They get very upset about issues that have to do with leading people to sin. Things that get in the way of your salvation in two directions. Paul's getting mad in Galatians because their teacher's saying you got to do a bunch of extra stuff before you can become a Christian. Let me translate that to today. You have to clean yourself up before you can come to church and follow Christ and be baptized. You got to clean up your act first. And Paul is vehement about that. That's what Jesus is mad at the Pharisees for. Not just that they were wrong, he disagreed with them, but he didn't get mad about what he disagreed with them about. They were wrong. He got mad when he said, you keep people from coming to God because of all this extra stuff you load on them. The other side is you'll see all over the New Testament teachers that are saying, you know what, it's not, sexual immorality is not really sin. you don't really need to give. You don't really need to do these things. In other words, telling you that sin is okay. That endangers your soul. On both sides of that, you'll see Jesus and everybody else get very angry, and it's a big deal. That's not just a case of being wrong, that's a case of jeopardizing others. Remember when Jesus said, no doubt that sin is going to come into the world, but woe to the one who leads one of these little ones astray. It would be better if they hung a stone around your neck and threw you into the ocean right now. In fact, you're going to have a way worse death than that. I mean, that's what he's saying. That would be a good death for you. I mean, he's dead serious about this. So the line between false teachers and just people with whom we disagree, I think, runs right down along the issue of sin and obstructions from people to get to God. Telling people that sin's okay, that's going to endanger them, or telling people they're not good enough to come to God. So I don't know if that's helpful to you or not, but to me, I think it's important that we react with love to people that we just disagree with, that maybe they're wrong, maybe I'm wrong, but it's just a matter of opinion. It's not an essential item. What's an essential item? Something that could make a difference in you coming to Christ, or something that could make a difference in you obeying Christ. That, to me, is the bright line. And that's where Nehemiah, no doubt he had disagreements with people, but you don't even hear about them because they were disagreements. And they compromised, or they worked them out, or whatever happened. What you hear about are the things that were evil. We're going to kill you to stop this work. We're going to tell you that God said something that God didn't say. And so I think Nehemiah kind of highlights a challenge that we also have, is the difference between disagreeing and what's evil. So that, I think, hopefully is helpful as you read the New Testament. Watch and see, where did the New Testament writers become very angry and become very serious? Where does Paul say, you're going to go to hell? I mean, that's a bold thing. Jesus said, you would be lucky to be able to die a good death. Peter says, oh, their destruction is not sleeping. God is going to do justice there. Wow, those are strong words. Why? Because they're about issues of salvation. Issues that are keeping people from or leading people astray on a salvation issue. They don't say that. They don't talk like that about people with whom they disagree on a doctrinal issue. And so I hope that we too as leaders can model that, because I think it hurts our leadership when we, have a nuclear blast on somebody that just disagrees with us. I think it also hurts us as leaders when we're not willing to stand up and say, this is not trivial. I really disagree with this, and I can't go down that road. And I think Nehemiah is a good example of that for us. And I think that we as leaders need to follow that same example. So to sum this up, you see some of the techniques that Nehemiah used. And truly, if you think about it, these challenges from within were harder to deal with than the enemy out there with the sword. At least that's a clear-cut challenge. And you know that, well, we better all get a sword and we better get ready to fight for our lives. The internal challenges are subtle, aren't they? They're insidious, and they're little by little, and they're betrayal. And so I think those are harder. And so I think the hardest opposition as a leader are the ones that are going to come from within. As you're leading, you see the challenges ahead. It's the ones that are coming from behind you that are the hardest to deal with. How does Nehemiah deal with it? Number one, he tries to rally the people and get above the disagreements by calling them all to in his case, serving God and being a fear of God. In other words, we're Jews, we're committed to God. We all agree on that, so come on, let's put our disagreements aside and let's go. He tries to get people to commit to a value greater than them. And then secondly, he leads by example. He says, nobody is going to be more committed to the welfare of this people than I am. And I think those two things are hugely powerful in helping to get over internal conflict. Make sense? Well, he's been a really good leader. He's halfway through chapter 6. He's still alive. They're still building the wall. And guess what happens next time? The wall gets finished. But he thought that was the end of the job. It turns out that's not even the main thing God brought him there for. You know what the main thing God brought him there for was? Yeah, we'll talk about that next week. So I'll see you guys next time.